Welcome, everybody. I think we've got everybody that is currently in the chat or in the waiting room admitted. So we're going to get started today. So I want to thank you for joining us for today's Bridge Lunch Break. My name is Kathy Kalashewski. I'm the executive editor for innovation at Bridge, Michigan, your source for nonprofit, nonpartisan news here in the state. In this event, we're going to be discussing how the policies coming out of the Trump administration are impacting Michiganders. The conversation will be moderated by Bridge Deputy Editor Jonathan Oosting with reporters Ron French and Lauren Gibbons. And we'll then turn to some reader questions. So please try to type any questions you have for our panelists into the chat window at any time. If you are not a panelist, we want to ask you to remain muted throughout today's discussion. We're recording today's conversation and it will be posted on Bridge Michigan this week. And you can subscribe to our newsletters by visiting www.bridgemi.com and click to sign up. Events like this one are made possible by the support of Bridge members. So if you'd like to join the membership community, we'll drop a link to do so in the chat. A reminder, please stay muted throughout the conversation. I'll now pass it over to Jonathan to get us started.
Jonathan,
you're on mute.
Okay, we're off to a great start. Well, hey, thank you, Kathy, and thanks everybody for joining us. I will try to not be on mute any longer for this discussion. I think it's going to be an interesting one. We at Bridge have been trying to cover President Donald Trump, and his policy impact here on Michigan. We started the year by cataloging the many, many promises he made as a candidate to voters in this state. In fact, we identified 100 of those promises, including a promise for a Michigan miracle. And we're going to be revisiting some of those pledges throughout the year to see how Trump has done. But we're also really diving in on how the president's early actions here in a second term are directly impacting the state. And Ron and Lauren, Ron French and Lauren Gibbons, who are here with me today, have been leading that coverage of his first 100 days. It's, of course, been a whirlwind. There's been hundreds of executive actions, statements, big policy shifts, sometimes announced in press conferences, sometimes announced on social media. It's been a lot to wrap all of our heads around and try and really assess the impact. But let's start there. I want to sort of ground this discussion for all of our viewers about how Bridge is approaching this coverage before we get into some of the particulars about what we've covered and the questions that you have as well. So let's start out with Ron. Ron, tell us a little bit about this. How are you and Lauren handling the workload? What's it been like so far, trying to make sense of all of this stuff?
Well, that's a very good question. If any of you as kids played outside and would stop to get a drink from a garden hose, and you had an older brother who would turn it on full steam and it'd spray all over you, that's sort of what it's been like here for since January 20th. It's just this fire hose coming at you every day. And as Jonathan said, some of it's just is on tweets. Some of it's from tweets from other people, from Elon Musk. Sometimes there are notifications that are being sent out to federal workers. And then what it's been like is for us sort of sorting through these things. I mean, there's no shortage of things we could write about. And also we luckily it's not, Lauren and I are sort of taking the lead on this, but luckily we have subject area specialists here at Bridge who have been fabulous, working with us, working their sources and giving us ideas on what they are hearing that help us figure out like what is actually going on, on the ground, as opposed to what you're seeing just on live. Because frankly, and I think all of you know this who are on this Zoom, that some things that you hear black one day is white 2 days later, and so we've been trying to be judicious about the subject matter we choose, because there's so many things we could choose from.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Lauren, following up on that, maybe give readers a little bit of a peek behind the curtain here. How does Bridge decide, what what to cover with so much going on from the White House and from President Trump. What are sort of the guiding principles for what we're hoping to focus on in our reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. And to Ron's point, there is just so much that we could cover every day. There's certainly been no shortage of news, but I think the main guidepost that we've been using as a team here at Bridge is just trying to avoid speculation, what could happen, what might happen, and really try to focus in on what is happening. And so sometimes that's still, still a little up in the air, right? There's a lot of groups, a lot of organizations, a lot of people who are wondering about whether they will continue to have government funding, for example, or whether tariffs will take effect. So there's still a lot of question marks out there, and we are addressing those to the best of our ability in our coverage. But what we don't want to do is, is just sort of leave these open-ended questions of like, oh, maybe this will impact Michigan residents. What we're really tailoring our coverage to right now is what is happening on the ground and what could very immediately happen should some of these policies go into effect.
Yeah. To that point, Ron, readers are probably curious. Is there stuff we're not going to cover coming out of the White House? Not necessarily because we can't cover it all, but maybe stuff that we're gonna wait and see on, perhaps.
Yeah, some of this may repeat a little what Lauren was saying, but we're going to work hard because there's so many choices we could be writing about on impact inside our own state. If it's a national issue, there are other places you can get that information. We want to be able to say, here's how it's affecting people who live in Michigan. So that's something that we're focusing on. And as Lauren said, a big thing for us is sorting through trying to separate what is being said from what has actually happened so far. I think we'll talk about it later, but deportations are one example of that. And you could write a lot about that, and not a lot has happened on the ground in Michigan so far. So that's what we're trying to do is say what has actually happened in the state and keep it as factual as possible.
Great. Yeah. So for the viewers at home, I'm an editor at Bridge, and I'm helping oversee our political coverage and coverage of President Trump's first 100 days. And I'll just note here at the outset too that we don't have a Washington D.C. reporter, so we're not going to be covering the machinations of negotiations and stuff like that very often without having some boots on the ground there in D.C. But to Ron and Lauren's point, we are trying to assess the impact here in the state on what those policy decisions have. But with that said, we are getting a lot of reader questions. We got a lot of reader questions already before this Zoom, and we are going to be obviously fielding more in the chat. Feel free to drop your questions there. But we got several questions already about some fairly breaking news. One thing that we haven't spent a lot of time covering at this point, which is what's going on with this big budget reconciliation deal, it's called, in Washington, D.C. The U.S. House yesterday approved this big bill that President Trump was backing. And a lot of the questions we're getting is how is that going to impact Medicaid specifically in the state? There's a lot of questions about what that might mean because it does that bill does require some spending cuts. So, Ron, what do we know about that? Can you fill in readers about what we're at least looking at or paying attention to, even if not jumping into coverage right now?
Sure. And again, it's one of those things we know is going to be happening. We know that there's a figure out there now that we can work with, but we don't know how the potential cuts will impact people yet. So they just are not specified yet. But it's something we're going to be following closely. Medicaid is obviously a huge program. 1 in 5 Americans are covered by it nationally. 1 in 4 adults with disabilities, nearly half of kids with special needs are covered by Medicaid. And certainly that applies in Michigan. But so what we're trying to look at is we know what happened last night, and we know that the committee that oversees Medicaid and Medicare has to cut $880 billion. So obviously there's going to be some cuts impacted there. And we just don't know. And so now the House and the Senate has to get together and figure out how those cuts are going to be applied. So we don't know what that could mean. The thought seems to be that there's going to be more cuts involved with Medicaid as opposed to Medicare. But does that mean more work requirements? Does it mean that some people just get cut off? Does it mean that some of the benefits are just trimmed? We just don't know yet. But it's going to be a huge deal in Michigan, and we can guarantee we're going to be all over it as it develops.
Great, thanks. Another somewhat breaking news, is this week, President Trump did say again that his tariffs that he's proposed for Canada and Mexico, quote, will go forward as planned, suggesting that his 1 month pause could end and the tariffs could take effect in March. Lauren, you did do some reporting on what those tariffs could mean for Michigan, a bit more forward looking. But walk us through the history here. What has actually happened, and why is it such a big deal to Michigan?
Yeah, so about this time last month, our colleagues Paula Gardner and I were about to, we were very prepared to write about tariffs going into effect in early February. And then at the last moment, they were pulled back. Canada and Mexico and the US came to a temporary agreement of sorts to hold off on those threatened 25% tariffs. So that's a pretty steep tariff on Canadian and Mexican imports. And I think it's no surprise to anyone on this call that especially with Canada, these tariffs would have an outsized impact on Michigan, particularly in the auto industry, where a lot of these parts are going back and forth before it even gets into a car in various stages of the production process. But there's other impacts too. In the energy sector is one example where we get a lot of oil and some other resources like natural gas and electricity from Canada, and agriculture. I think in agriculture we get a lot of Mexican fruits and vegetables throughout the year is one example of that. And Canada and Mexico are both the places where Michigan agriculture goes as well. So there's a lot on the line here, and Michigan would probably be one of the top states impacted by tariffs. That said, moving forward, the president has said that they're probably going to start next month, but as we saw last time, we'll see. I think a lot of this has been more of a threat of tariffs as opposed to following through so far. That doesn't mean he couldn't in the future.
Sure, we've certainly seen the president use the threat of tariffs as a negotiating tactic so far as well. But there have been some tariffs implemented already. So another question for Lauren along those lines about what it sounds like it's happening versus what's actually happening. So on his first day in office, Trump also signed executive orders that he said would end an EV mandate and end also what he calls the Green New scam, I think he actually called it. Lauren, what was that about? And is it really so easy for him to change federal policy or block federal spending with just an executive order?
Yeah, this is another area where Michigan has a lot on the line. Michigan projects were in line for millions of dollars in federal funding for some of these green energy projects. To your question, though, it's not easy. This is something that had already been approved. It was already in the process. So downplaying those projects or backing out of some of these projects will be very, very complex. So I think that's one of the areas where it's these are priorities for the Trump administration. They're interested in changing, but the implications go well beyond just pressing a button and stopping a project. In a lot of cases, there's a lot of job creation on the line. A lot of these projects are well in the works. So it's a very difficult. It's a very difficult thing and different from saying this is going to stop and actually stopping those projects.
For sure. We have seen some pretty aggressive attempts by the Trump administration and Elon Musk at Doge to try and really slash the federal workforce. This was something President Trump tried to do his first term a little bit as well. But Ron, what are we seeing there in terms of impact on Michigan? I know we don't have specific numbers yet. Even the unions tracking this don't know exactly how many federal workers have been laid off in Michigan. But what impacts have we seen? What do we know so far?
Sure. I hate to sound like a broken record, but we still don't know for sure. But we do know that a lot of federal employees, at least in federal employee groups, have been given notifications that their jobs are either been terminated or new job offers have been rescinded. And one of the areas that is of that we can specify a little bit on is some of the national parks and national forests in Michigan. Soon after after the new administration took office, the administration rescinded new job offers for National State Park Service and the forests, along with the seasonal workers who work at these parks. And those are these seasonal workers that are there in the summer. Those are the people that keep the parks running a lot of times. They're the ones working the gates. They're the ones cleaning the bathrooms. They're the ones providing services and telling you which way to go on certain hikes so you don't get lost. These people are invaluable, and all these job offers were rescinded. And so there was going to be a really concern about like what the national parks, either that you visit here in Michigan or if you're traveling out west or out south, what it could look like. Now, just the other day, again, there was a notification that they were rescinding the rescissions. So there's a possibility that, and supposedly they were going to be hiring seasonal workers again, but it's still unclear whether they're just offering these jobs again, or they're starting the job offer process over again, which is getting very late in the season to do that. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. That generally when you talk to federal workers, there's a sense that they know that there's going to be a smaller workforce. They just don't know who or how much yet.
Yeah, thanks. And just to point out, Trump and Musk in particular have talked a lot about wanting to both cut costs for the federal government and shrink what they call the, permanent bureaucracy, or sometimes they call it the deep state, but, essentially try and weed out, folks who have been going along with status quo. So we obviously have seen some impacts here, but just wanted to give that framing there for the justification at this point for these actions. Lauren, you also wrote about one kind of interesting wrinkle about something I've hiked before, the North Country Trail. What did you learn about that, and how the federal funding and worker freezes could impact that system here that runs through Michigan?
Yeah, I think this is one small example of the ways, the vast number of ways that pulling back on federal commitments and the workforce impacts a lot more than just the federal workforce, right? So the North Country Trail runs through several states, but it's the longest section is in Michigan. We have a little over 1,000 miles of this trail that runs through both the Upper and Lower Peninsula. And this is primarily run by a nonprofit, but it's organized and maintained and funded in large part by federal funds. This is a federally recognized trail, so some of these worker cuts could definitely impact the maintenance, but also the federal funds. About a quarter of the nonprofit's budget is funded by the National Park Service, and that funding is in question starting next spring. And it's one of those, I think, like I said, a small facet of this, but it just shows how many broader implications are in play for federal cuts and losses here.
Thank you, Lauren. Ron, we've already been getting questions on this. Rusty, for instance, in the chat asked, are we seeing migrant deportations in Michigan? President Trump, of course, ran on a campaign pledge to lead a mass deportation effort. Are we actually seeing that yet here in Michigan at this point?
Short answer is no. I think from talking to people who work in this field, there is sort of normal amount of deportations, and certainly the immigration courts are still running full speed ahead. But there has been no like big roundups, that I think people were sort of anticipating might happen to try to reach the large numbers that the new administration was suggesting they wanted to try to reach with deportations. Now, doesn't mean it might not be down the road, but we have not seen that yet. What we have seen are some efforts that have become a bit of a challenge for groups that try to assist undocumented immigrants or help immigrants get certain immigration status. There was for a week or two, again, one of these things that again switched back and forth, but there was a stop work order for immigration legal services in immigration courts across the country, and that affected the court in Detroit, where, and this was a service, they don't actually represent, they're not the lawyers for immigrants. Immigrants, because it's a civil proceeding, not a criminal proceeding, that they aren't given free counsel, but it is something that is set up there so that immigrants can have a clearer understanding in their own language as to how the process works. But anyway, so that system it was shut down for a while. But then it was then that was rescinded, so it's operating again for the moment. But what you're seeing though is because of the language that the new administration has used and their vows to try to deport a lot more people than in the past. What you are seeing is it is having an impact on the immigrant communities in Michigan. One of the things you're seeing, frankly, is that families are coming in and they're creating these what amounts to a kind of a guardianship. It's sort of a parental authority for where they give the legal right for someone else to have legal authority over their kids if they are not in the area, for families who are worried that the parents may be deported. And so I know in Detroit there's been a big effort to reach out to immigrant families to see if they want these sort of forms filled out, and it's the first time that they've ever done that. Obviously from their point of view, they hope they never have to use it, but they were concerned about what could happen to the children. So it is, even before or even if there is some mass deportation in Michigan, it is having an impact. There's even talk that some immigrants have chosen to leave the country, which is exactly what the administration would wish would happen anyway. But so it is having an impact even before you see big buses come through the cities.
Thanks, Ron. And Lauren, of course, it's not just undocumented immigrants. President Trump has also suspended a refugee resettlement program that has brought folks to the country and given them legal status. So not undocumented anymore, but refugees. And there's been some impact there as well. What have you seen in your reporting?
Yeah, and I think that is a really important point to note. Refugees and similar status, humanitarian parole is another example. They do have legal status. They were vetted by government officials and allowed in. They petitioned for legal status while still in another country. So that's an important distinction to make when you're talking about refugees versus folks who don't have documentation to be in the U.S. legally. And in terms of the refugee resettlement program, Michigan has long been one of the top 10 states in terms of refugee intake nationally. We have a lot of groups here like Samaritas, Bethany Christian Services, the several like Catholic and Jewish and um, Muslim organizations, usually faith-based organizations that take in refugees and work with the federal government to provide housing and a lot of the initial steps needed to move to a new country, like helping with legal documents, helping get their kids in school. And so it's a pretty intensive process. Now, where this has really impacted Michigan is a number of refugees had already entered the country and had just touched down or had only been in the country for a few weeks or days, even in some cases. Excuse me. And so those refugees were already here, and the federal government suspended the program and ordered a stop work on the contracts that a lot of these faith-based organizations have with the federal government. So what's been happening is a lot of these organizations have really been pushing for external fundraising, raising as much as they can, through their own channels, but also still petitioning to see if they can get this program back up and running, at least for the people who are already here. And there were also others who were scheduled to come into Michigan in the next weeks and months over the course of 2025 that are currently on pause. So people who were planning on coming maybe had already made arrangements to come to the US are now not able to. So they're also in limbo.
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate that. Really good reporting there too. Folks should read that if they haven't already. I believe we've dropped a link in the chat. Sticking with immigration real quick, Ron, you've done some reporting on this. The Trump administration has threatened to withhold funding from sanctuary cities, so-called sanctuary cities. Can he do that? And what is a sanctuary city or county or community?
Yeah, I think that would be pretty challenging because there is no actual definition for what a sanctuary city is. So and Michigan was not ever really one of the real hotbeds for that designation. There were communities in Michigan that sort of played around the edges with that and voted to call themselves welcoming cities, where they welcome everyone to come to their community and they will be treated equally. But does that count as a sanctuary city? I think really what it comes down to is the biggest legal piece that could have an impact is if there were communities that did not cooperate with ICE. And there's even question as to how much you have to cooperate. One of the things that comes up a lot is if a county has an undocumented immigrant in their jail and they're scheduled to be released on Friday, does the county need to inform ICE that, hey, we have this guy, we're releasing him Friday in case you want to pick him up? So there's that can be a sticky wicket, I guess, but so far that hasn't happened. I think the sanctuary city thing itself, I think is probably not something that cities in Michigan are going to have to worry about.
Yeah, I will note we've done some other reporting with our Capitol team that the House Republicans are also here in the Michigan legislature are proposing a system where they won't allow earmarks for so-called community sanctuary communities. And in that case, they're not relying on any definition. They're saying if you want to apply or qualify for earmarks, you got to send this information proving that you're not a sanctuary city. So they're putting the onus on the communities in that case. We'll see what happens there. Thanks, Joan and Rusty both mentioned that there have been lawsuits over the refugee resettlement program. That's the case for a lot of this stuff, folks. A lot of this is already being litigated in court, and will continue to be. Lauren, can you just pivot real quick? Can you tell us a little bit about that? I know you've been looking at some of the steps the Attorney General has been taking too here in Michigan. What are you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just seeing those comments and thinking I should say something anyway. A lot of the uncertainty that we've discussed, a lot of the reason that we don't exactly know what will happen in a lot of these cases, not just for refugee resettlement or immigration, but also in the funding sphere. There's been court challenges to just about every one of the topics we've discussed today. And so those are currently in court. We've seen, I guess with one exception, tariffs have not been court challenged because they haven't been court challenged. With everything else just about has been. And so a lot of those are in the early stages. As Jonathan mentioned, Attorney General Dana Nessel is involved in a lot of the challenges that states have signed on to. A number of them have been brought up by state prosecutors. Attorney General Dana Nessel has been part of a lot of those. Some of the other ones have been brought by outside organizations, including the refugee resettlement, but also the USAID is another area, and federal funding and grants have also been challenged in court. That you've seen some funding get reinstated. There's also been continued court hearings alleging that the federal government hasn't released funds the court told them to release. So it's an ongoing process that we're still learning more about every day. But I would say keep your eyes peeled for additional coverage on legal cases in a lot of these topics.
Thanks, Lauren. Folks, a reminder, a lot of you are dropping comments and questions in the chat. I appreciate that. We're going to get to more of those coming up soon. But I did want to ask a real quick turn to education a little bit. Ron, President Trump, as he said he would do in the campaign, has been trying to target what he calls woke ideology in schools and universities across the country. That includes some attempts to crack down on transgender athletes participating in sports. Most recently, he's threatened to withhold federal funding from education institutions that don't get rid of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies by the end of the month. What impact is that having so far, Ron? What are you seeing?
Yeah, as this has gone along, I keep thinking, this is going to be a really good discussion a year from now. We should already just put it on the calendar because I think there'll be a lot more clarity for a lot of these questions. For the moment, what we're seeing, Jonathan, is that transgender athletes in Michigan will continue to be allowed to participate for now. Okay, it doesn't mean that it won't change soon, but that's the status so far, and that and pretty much the same with DEI in the schools. Again, it's how do you define what DEI is? Are we talking about like a hiring practice, or are we talking about teaching Black history, an AP Black history class? There's not been a lot of movement on that. Michigan has been a little, as you might anticipate, with the Democratic leadership we have now, there's been resistance to changing that. It doesn't mean that this is going to end up in court. Certainly, Michigan might be one of the states that Donald Trump decides to take a hard look at.
For sure. Ron, you mentioned the transgender athletes. Lauren, I know you didn't report on this directly, but you have in the past. How big of an issue is that in Michigan?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an issue that has come up a lot, as a topic in schools. And a lot of these local school districts have been grappling with differing opinions from parents and others in the school community about how to handle this. But in terms of the hard data, this is not going to impact a lot of school districts or school sports teams. There are currently two transgender girls who are being tracked by the Michigan High School Athletic Association. And so those two students, unless something changes or there's additional clarity that forces the hand of the association, they are going to allow those two students to continue playing on their respective teams. So it's more of a political issue at this point than it is, an actual on the ground issue for a lot of these school districts. But this is something that has come up over and over again in terms of social policy and social issues that have just been a talking point in not only the presidential campaign, but a lot of these local and state level races.
Mhm. But Ron, we have seen at the university level, at least, some colleges are taking steps to at least rename programs that might have sounded like DEI programs, or move employees around. I know Michigan Tech and I believe the U of M Nursing School have both taken steps in those directions. But there's also been sort of a chilling effect where folks like aren't sure, is this DEI? Are we going to get in trouble for this? Like, because, similar to, as you mentioned with sanctuary cities, there's not necessarily a clear definition. So what have you seen there? I know you've done some reporting on some proactive cancellations of events and things like that.
Right. Yeah, the colleges have been much more willing to change things. Let me put it that way. I think, to be honest, I think public universities in particular feel they're a lot more vulnerable because they get so much research money from the federal government, and so that seems like an easy pot of money that could be taken away. And so they there's been a lot of discussions behind the scenes apparently about like what do we do about this? What do we need to rename a couple of these things so it doesn't have DEI in the title? One of the most interesting examples, I don't know how significant it is, but it highlights how careful universities are trying to be. Michigan State University canceled a Lunar New Year celebration for mainly for Chinese students recently. It's something they've had for years, but they felt that might be connected, and it might raise alarms as far as like, is this something that is too DEI like that we're having a celebration for a specific group of minority students as opposed to all students. There was a lot of backtracking afterward, people sort of denying that the administration had much to do with that. But the point is that you see that sort of thing happen, probably a lot more than we know about is happening right now, especially at the public universities. And you got to understand, it's there's a lot of money at stake, and especially in research, which we haven't talked about. But it's like you can see why they want to make sure that money, which really it's not just money for the university. It's the research that helps with cancer and Alzheimer's and things like that. You want to make sure that stuff keeps going, and if that takes renaming a couple of officers, then I think public universities are looking at the possibility of doing that.
Sure. Thank you. Well, as mentioned, folks, we do want to leave plenty of time for reader questions here at the end. So I'm going to pivot now to some of those. As I mentioned, a lot of folks submitted questions already when registering. We're getting plenty more in the chat here as well. So to start, Ron, we've had several questions now about K-12 schools, and specifically, we had one earlier about can K-12 schools survive without federal funding if they keep DEI programs? And then we've also had questions about what happens if the federal government shutters the Department of Education. Trump, of course, said on the campaign trail he wanted to do that. There's been some reporting from national publications that his administration is still figuring out best steps for how to do that, or at least try and do that. In any case, Ron, tell us about federal funding and Michigan schools.
Sure. Big topic. Yeah, can schools survive? Sure, they can. But more than one in every $10 for state schools comes from the federal government. Can you survive, on your family account if suddenly 11% of your funds are gone? Probably. But that's a huge cut when you're thinking about how the schools operate now. So it's 11% of a $20.6 billion planned school aid fund. So a lot of that money goes to Title I for schools, which helps low-income kids and special education students with disabilities. You've got Head Start, which is a federal program. You got federal preschool. You got federal lunches. Free school lunches. So there's a lot of things that are impacted that way. That can they survive? Yeah, but it wouldn't look the same, and I think people would be very unhappy about it. And as far as going along with federal funding for education, when we talk about the elimination of the federal Department of Education. Some of those programs, what I've heard is that some of those programs would be farmed out into other departments, and so it's not like they hopefully would not just completely disappear. But there's a lot of money that would be gone. We can tell you that I think it's between a third and a half of all employees in the state Department of Education are fully federally funded. So you're talking about people packing their boxes in the State Department of Education if they decide to cut a lot of the federal education money. In the same way with the state program, which works now with preschool and college programs. A lot of those are federally funded positions. So, getting rid of the federal program would have a local impact, no doubt about it.
Lauren, we got a question that's a little bit more backwards looking, not about the Trump administration specifically, but a reader asked, what about non-transparent expenditures in the last days of the Biden administration? This reader said, as an EPA worker said, it was like throwing gold bars off the Titanic. What do we know about that, Lauren?
Yeah, so just to start, full disclosure, this is not something that we have spent a ton of time looking into because we haven't seen many direct connections or impacts on Michigan. But just for some context, that comment was not, it was the new EPA administrator, Lee Zeldin. He was a Trump political appointee, and he was discussing funding for climate-focused nonprofit that was reportedly connected to former Georgia governor candidate Stacey Abrams. So again, that's not the biggest Michigan connection, so it's not something we have spent a whole ton of time on. But to that point, the Biden administration did move to accelerate funding for some of these Michigan projects through programs like the Inflation Reduction Act, which we talked a little bit about earlier, and the CHIPS and Sciences Act. One of those projects was $325 million for the Hemlock Semiconductor in the Saginaw region. That was a big federal award that came shortly before the presidential election, so there was some concern by Republicans that timing could have been an attempt to sway voters one way or the other. So that's sort of the Michigan connection that we've seen.
We also had a question, Ron, I'm going to jump here to question about transportation. What effects could Trump policies have on transportation here in Michigan? Have we seen much on that front? Obviously, our governor is again talking about trying to fix the roads, so could that be complicated?
Wow. Tell me if you heard me say this before. We really don't know yet. For the most part, we just don't know what's going to happen with transportation. One of Trump's orders would have frozen additional spending through a bipartisan infrastructure law, is it going to happen for sure? We don't know yet. And so again, it's one of those things that we're going to have to wait and see. There's like I said, there's a lot of questions out there, and this is the most, active new administration I recall. And so that's why we have two full-time reporters that are doing nothing but trying to keep track of it. So we'll keep you informed.
For sure. Thanks. Ron, or sorry, Lauren, I'm going to go to you. The question from a reader, Michigan is trying to grow its population. We've had pretty stagnating population. Is there any indication of what Trump policies might mean for those efforts?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty hard question to answer right now. But one thing I will mention, as I was doing some of this reporting on refugees and new Americans, a lot of business groups have said this is the way that we can grow our population pretty quickly. We haven't seen a whole ton of interest in people moving from other states to Michigan in recent memory. But we have gotten a steady stream of new Americans through immigration. So that's an area of concern for people who are following this issue. But as Ron mentioned, the Federal Department of Transportation is trying to encourage childbirth and marriage. The state's own efforts to grow the population are pretty much state funded, but if there's a huge gap in federal funding, that could change the entire budget process and require funds to be shifted to other priorities. So I think there's a lot of unknowns at the state level as well. So I think there's just a lot of unknowns about the overall impact on the population, but definitely some trend lines that people are watching pretty closely.
Yeah, follow up on what Lauren was saying there. There at one point was a memo that suggested that U.S. Department of Transportation funds will be somehow tied to rates of population growth and marriage rates. And as I'm sure everyone in this call knows, if they're tying funds to population growth, we're in trouble. And marriage rates, I guess Utah's going to have like roads paved with gold, but Michigan's going to have some challenges if they were to follow through on something like that.
Great, thanks, Ron. Lauren, I don't know if you've looked at this issue specifically, but I know you've been looking at some federal spending cuts and freezes and stuff like that. So a question from Kim Peters, given that USAID food aid comes from U.S. farmers, are you hearing any, nervousness from farmers, or has there been any impact that you're aware of specifically right off the bat?
Yeah, I think it's something that Michigan farmers are definitely watching and keeping an eye on. There's a lot going on for farmers right now in Michigan. Concern about the tariffs, concern about food aid, and sending exports out. Also, the Farm Bill is going on in Congress, so there's a lot happening that could impact Michigan's agricultural community. Another area that USAID is currently funding. That's a big issue in Michigan. I'm currently working on a story about, and I've talked to some Michigan State University researchers who have been in partnership with this program for decades at this point, looking into crops and studying different diseases or different methods of farming that really have had an impact on what Michigan farmers do. So in addition to some of these immediate concerns that farmers are following, there's also a concern about the long-term health of Michigan's ag research community.
Great, thank you. Another reader question from Diane. I'm going to pose this to you, Ron. Have you looked at any impact on scientific studies? Obviously, the federal government funds a lot of research. What have you seen there? Have those been, has any of that funding been impacted already in Michigan?
There's a great fear about that in the university sector about how this could affect research, and also about research that's been completed, and whether some of the data sets that groups use are still going to be available. I think some of them were pulled off. I think some were returned. But yeah, the concern was I know that National Science Foundation and National Institute of Health funding was frozen for a while. Then it was unfrozen. There was a question of like, well, but there was a question of whether all of it came back. We get emails occasionally from researchers and professors who say, "Oh, I just received this letter saying that my project has been put on hold." Or they can't access the money they need to pay their employees because it's you don't get all your money right up front. So yeah, there's great concern about that. And particularly because like of the different priorities of different administrations, this administration probably, I think it's fair to say, is not going to be as friendly to climate change research as the past administration, and that could have an impact on a NOAA office that does climate research in Alpena. Will the research continue? Will the employees still be there? There are professors from different universities that go there to do work. And there's medical research, huge at Michigan State, Michigan, and Wayne State. Among others, so yeah, there's great concern. Again, it's one of those things where people are sort of trying to sort through and see what happens when things shake out, because a few of the things that happened the first few weeks, they're already backing off of and returning funding.
Thanks, Ron. Lauren, I'm not sure we know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you anyways, put you on the hot seat. Do you have any idea of impact on funding on SULOCs or the Great Lakes Initiative? That's a question from Michael in our chat.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can speak to this a little bit. I have not seen any news or any concern about the SULOCs project. A lot of that funding has already been approved, and as far as I'm aware, at this stage, still scheduled to be on track. As far as the Great Lakes Initiative, that is an open question that a lot of environmental advocates are concerned about, because in Trump's first administration, he attempted several times to cut or eliminate funding for this initiative. He's run into a lot of bipartisan opposition. Pretty much any Great Lakes lawmaker in Michigan and other states touching the Great Lakes has been pretty supportive of this, or members of the Great Lakes Caucus, including, as I believe the article was the Grist did a pretty interesting article on this. J.D. Vance is a previous supporter of GLRI. So there's still a question about whether that funding could get wrapped up in some of these DOGE efforts or some of the other federal spending freezes. But I think this in particular is an issue where there's a lot of bipartisan support, and there would be a lot of bipartisan opposition if Great Lakes funding was cut.
Yeah, I'd be remiss. Remember, Trump famously praised the record deepness of the Great Lakes when he reversed the Great Lakes Initiative. A very memorable quote when he restored funding for it, anyways, during his first term. So he is on record supporting the program and the record deepness of the lakes, which I think weren't actually record deep, right? But pretty darn deep. In any case, Ron, we've touched on this a little bit before, but a question from Kristen about infrastructure funding being on hold, or at least attempting to be, attempted to be put on hold by the Trump administration. How's this going to affect Michigan construction projects? Do we know at this point?
I don't think we know at this point, and we'll see. But I think a lot of that, the projects are already in the works. I think they will continue. There's a lot of state funding involved there also. So I think we as far as like long term, we just don't know yet, unfortunately.
Sure. I will note, I think maybe you mentioned this already, Ron, but there was some for instance, some of these funding clawbacks, talk about infrastructure law in general, but it seemed to be really focused on EV chargers. One of our colleagues, Kelly House, has done some good reporting on that. The state got something like $110 million allocated to it from the federal government for EV chargers and has already spent or committed a lot of that, but there is about $30 million hanging out there that the state hasn't allocated that could certainly be at risk or potentially not coming to the state at this point. Kelly talked to a spokesperson for the Michigan Department of Transportation who told us something that could apply to some of any number of things that we're still trying to wrap our heads around. She said the impact is clear as mud right now. So even state transportation officials in that case are really trying to figure out what this all means as well. But with that, folks, I'm sorry we did not get to all the questions, but we do have to begin to wrap this up right now. So I'm going to kick it back to Kathy to bring this home. Thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thank you, Jonathan and Ron and Lauren and all the folks that joined us today for this very, very compelling conversation. I have to say, lots of great questions. And, I'm really happy to see folks kind of joining us and engaging on these issues that are so important to Michigan. So I want to remind you all that we're going to be posting a recording of this program on Bridge's website, on our app, and some of our social media channels this week. So if you've joined us late or you know somebody who cares about these issues impacting the state, you can access this conversation in those places and share widely. I want to also remind you to subscribe to our newsletters and to follow us on our social media channels. I think Jackie's going to drop a link to the sign up in the chat as well, but you can also go to bridgemi.com and click the sign up link for that. So thank you all. And we have another lunch break coming up at the end of March. Right now, it's scheduled to be focused on aging in Michigan and what it's like to be growing old in our state and the resources and opportunities and challenges that brings us. So look for more of that in our coverage, and we'll say good day to you all. Thank you.